Hey guys, welcome to Little Nightmares, where chilling tales come to life. Stay tuned for spine-tingling stories that will keep you up at night. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to never miss the next scare. This story takes place 4 years ago, and it still haunts me to this day. It was Christmas night, and my family were driving home from this fancy restaurant. I, unlike my family, wasn't tired, so the 45-minute drive seemed perpetual. On top of that, my little sister was constantly moaning about how her friend didn't get her anything for Christmas. After about 20 minutes of driving, my dad stopped at a gas station to get some cigarettes, and my sister, brother, and mother all got out to pee. I stayed in the car as I had already gone before we left. Once they all left, I decided to play a few games on my phone. I looked at the car clock and saw that 10 minutes had passed. So I immediately wondered what was taking them so long. As soon as I peered out the car window, I saw a man staring at our car. The man startled me as I didn't know how long he had been watching. What made it even more unnerving is that he had a plain blank face. No expression was shown. It was hard to make out any features as it was pretty dark, and he wasn't standing in an illuminated part of the station. He was about 5'9" and looked to be middle-aged. Once he saw me notice him, he started walking towards the car, and I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't scared. Luckily, my dad came back with the rest of the family just as the man took a couple steps. My dad apologized and told me he had been in an argument with the cashier. I didn't care. I was just glad that my dad was with me. I took another glance at the man outside, and he was still staring, but this time he had an annoyed look on his face. We drove off, and for the rest of the car ride, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. This wouldn't have been too bad if it had ended there, but it didn't. Later that night, I was watching YouTube while everyone else slept, and luckily for me, a storm was raging over us. I enjoy storms. It makes me cozy as I'm laying bed. I put my phone down and just enjoyed the ambience. That didn't last for long as I heard something smash into the window behind me. I lurched forward and nearly fell out of the bed. I thought a bird had just smashed into the window. I parted the blinds, and what I saw next haunted me. I saw a man standing out by my parents' cars, looking up at my room. I took a closer look, and I nearly had a heart attack. It was the same man that I saw at the gas station, only this time, when our eyes met, he grinned. Being the 14-year-old I did the manly thing and screamed at the top of my lungs. My dad came running down the stairs and entered my room. "Why the fuck are you screaming?" he said. I told him about the man, and I explained everything that had happened. My dad grabbed a baseball bat and told me to call the police. After 10 minutes, the police turned up outside our house and found the man in our shed. He got arrested, and that was the last time I saw him. The next day, my dad inspected the house, and we found the handle of our back door had been damaged, but not completely broken. This gives me an eerie feeling, as if he actually managed to get in, he could have harmed us or possibly killed us. When selling a house, if a death occurred within 3 years of the house going on the market, the seller is required to inform potential buyers of said death. This little requirement wasn't necessary in my case. Everyone within a 50-mile radius seemed to know about Victoria Teller. It was a tragic story. She had given birth to a bouncing baby boy, whose father no one seemed to know. The baby passed away just a few months later, and Victoria took her own life a year after that. That much was known to be true. What was unknown were the circumstances surrounding the incidents. How the baby died, some said accident, some said illness, some said murder. How Victoria killed herself, and what happened in between. The popular rumor was that Victoria, in her grief-stricken psychosis, began buying dolls to replace her dearly departed son. The doll would then suffer the same fate as the real baby in her mind, and she would bury it and move on to another. People, mostly teenagers, made it a Halloween tradition to search for the doll graveyard. They searched the backyard and the woods behind it, but nothing was found in the 6 years that the house was empty. I was confident that the house that I had bought for my family and me had nothing strange in its history, but two tragic deaths. The first few months living in the Teller house were uneventful. I had to occasionally shoo away curious locals that weren't aware that our house was no longer empty, but I found no ghosts or satanic symbols or anything of the like. It seemed that it was just a house, one that I got a huge discount on because of what happened there, and the bad juju was rumored to have acquired because of it. By the time the Christmas season rolled around, I had pretty much forgotten about Victoria Teller. It was the first year that my son, Caleb, was really aware of anything other than presents. We lined the roof and windows with lights, hung a wreath on the door, and put some standing decorations on the lawn. We bought and decorated a tree big enough to fit a toy store underneath, which was appropriate because of how many presents Santa was going to bring Caleb that year. He was getting more excited each day, especially since we had been dropping some pretty big hints that he was getting a puppy. My family was the happiest it had ever been until a week before Christmas. My wife had been wrapping presents as we bought them so that we didn't have to stay up all night on Christmas Eve like we had in previous years. She had opened the door to the closet that held the presents to find the wrapping paper torn to shreds. Her first thought was that Caleb had gotten into them, but I doubted that he would be able to contain his excitement if he had. It looked almost as if some sort of rodents had shredded the paper, but the boxes weren't damaged at all. We brushed it off as a mystery and moved the presents to the attic after rewrapping them. I occasionally heard some shuffling from inside that closet, but I never saw whatever critter had caused it. I figured I would call an exterminator after Christmas to check inside the walls. Soon things started to get really strange. I walked into the bathroom to find the dirty clothes scattered around the room and the hamper on its side. My wife found the refrigerator door hanging open, with food torn up and thrown on the floor. Caleb was distraught one morning when he woke up to find all of the toys that he had carefully placed in his toy box the night before had been thrown all around his room while he slept. All this, and the noises in the walls were getting more frequent and were heard everywhere in the house. My superstitious wife was becoming scared that the local urban legend was true, that Victoria Teller still haunted the house. She reasoned that the spirit was becoming more active because we were so happily preparing for the holiday with our son, something she never got to do. I laughed at her theory. I shouldn't have. Christmas Eve, my wife and I put Caleb to bed. We had to return to his room several times to tell him that if he didn't go to sleep, Santa wouldn't bring him anything. When I was convinced that he was finally going to stay in his bedroom, I picked the puppy up from my mother's house and brought it home. We hadn't named him yet, but he was a golden retriever puppy that was as energetic as he was soft and fluffy. After playing with him for a while, we put him to bed in his crate, ate the cookies Caleb left for Santa, and turned in for the night. I was jerked from my slumber by a blood-curdling scream. My wife and I followed our son's cries for help to the living room. Caleb had snuck out of bed and found the puppy. Instead of the happy fluff ball that we had left by the tree, he found a mangled metal crate filled and surrounded by fur, blood, and chunks of discarded meat. My wife took Caleb into another room to console him, while I checked for intruders and signs of a break-in. I found nothing, so I returned to the living room and began cleaning up the mess. I was kneeling on the floor, convincing myself that there was a silver lining in the fact that we had hardwood floors instead of carpet, when I heard a tinkling noise come from the tree. I turned my head just in time to see a pair of big blue eyes staring at me from the branches. I jumped to my feet and backed up a few paces just as the first doll dropped from the tree. It was followed by 3 others. They were those delicate porcelain dolls, wearing what were probably pretty little dresses at one time. I couldn't tell, because the dresses were covered in dirt and blood. I watched with a mixture of terror and disbelief as all 4 dolls slowly rose from the ground and started toward me. The screams of my wife and son snapped me out of my horrified trance. The dolls' heads turned as I ran from the room to find my family. I raced up the stairs to my bedroom, where I found my wife standing on our bed with Caleb in her arms. Dozens of porcelain dolls, varying in states of damage and filth, were standing on the floor surrounding the bed. They were making their way toward my loved ones with their tiny arms stretched out, reaching for the woman and child who were desperately trying to stay away. I started kicking the little demons out of the way as I hurried to the rescue of my wife and child. I didn't think a bunch of fucking dolls would be so hard to push through, but I was wrong. For every one that I kicked away, more came at me. They grabbed and pulled and thrashed and bit, and I found myself moving away from the bed instead of toward it. After noticing that most of the dolls had directed their attention to me, I yelled for my wife to run. I hoped that I served as enough of a distraction for the demon toys that her and Caleb could get away unharmed. The dolls that were still trying to reach them were clinging to the sides of the bed, climbing with delicate little hands. My wife jumped off of the bed, stumbled, and fell. Caleb's head hit the floor, and the resulting cries caught the attention of many of the dolls I was desperately trying to fight off and keep away. My wife tried to right herself and gather our son before the wave of small monsters got to them, but she was too slow. I watched as the dolls quickly swarmed Caleb and began tearing at his flesh. My wife started trying to get them away, but they turned on her when Caleb stopped thrashing. I made my way to them just as my wife stopped fighting. I saw the despair in her eyes as a doll with black hair and a gray tattered dress bit a chunk from her throat. The creatures moved so fast. There were so many of them. We didn't stand a chance. I don't know how long I stood in my bedroom, watching a horde of dolls ripping apart the two people I loved most in the world, before I realized that I was no longer being attacked. Every porcelain creature was crowded around what was left of my wife and son, feasting on them. I regretted what I did next every day since. I ran. I bounded down the steps as fast as my feet would carry me. I reached the front door when I heard a woman's voice come from the second floor. "That's right, my children. Fill those bellies so you can grow big and strong." I shut the door behind me and fell down the steps of the front porch. After vomiting up the cookies I had eaten earlier that night, I turned to look at the house. Peeking out of the window, illuminated by the colorful Christmas lights, was a gaunt woman wearing a tattered black dress. She smiled through a veil of stringy hair as a doll climbed up the front of her dress and into her arms, then closed the curtain. Christmas has been a rough time of the year for me. All my friends and classmates were always filled with the festive spirit and excited for the plethora of gifts that sat nestled under their trees. But my Christmas were never like that. My family was broken, mostly thanks to the cruelty of my father. He was a heavy drinker, and what time he didn't spend at the bar was usually spent on tirades against my mother and physical confrontations with my 16-year-old brother. Tommy. My father was the kind that never seemed satisfied with anything. My mother's meals were never tasty enough. Tommy's attitude and direction in life wasn't admirable enough. More than once I watched them fight, with my father expelling his wrath upon them both. He broke Tommy's arm twice, and left my mother with multiple scars and bruises. Tommy and I were always close, but as time went on, he came home less and less. My mother slipped further into depression and became more reclusive as a result of the abuse. She never talked about it, just did what she could and tried not to ignite the temper of my father. She tried hiding it from me, but I heard her crying in her room almost every night. I hope I don't come across as a Grinch who's trying to ruin the holidays for everyone else, because there was once a time when I absolutely adored Christmas. It was usually one of the few reprieves our family had from my father's wickedness. Maybe it was his eggnog mixed with bourbon that did it, but he always seemed a little less mean on Christmas. Growing up, my mother had told me all about the legend of jolly old Santa Claus, a plump, red-nosed man who rode on a magical sleigh driven by stags and brought people presents. It may sound dumb, but that story filled me with hope. My family had always been pretty poor, and the idea that there was a man out there who dedicated one night of the year to distribute gifts out of the kindness of his heart really inspired me. Every year I would write him a letter, usually asking for some toy or the latest gadget that all the kids at school were getting. My 7th Christmas was different though. I had sort of begun to grow out of the legend of Santa Claus, especially with the apparent lack of results. I wasn't even planning on writing a letter that year, but Mom encouraged me to give it one last try. I really wanted a Nintendo 64, but something else was more important. For years, I had watched my mother suffer at the hands of my father, and as a young boy who could do nothing about it, it really hurt me. I knew it was wrong, and so I asked Santa for help. I asked if he could make Mom happy again. I took the letter and folded it up, leaving it under a plate of cookies and tall glass of milk by the tree as was my tradition. You still believe in that horseshit, do you? My father's gruff voice slurred the words as I set the gift down. I turned back to him, seeing his bearded face contained droplets of eggnog. His pajama pants were worn and dirty, and his stained Metallica t-shirt was on its last leg. He gave a grumbling laugh as we met eyes. What a fucking concept, huh? Some fat guy that brings presents to everybody. Ain't nobody in the damn world gonna give you shit for free like that. He took a gulp from his glass and sighed. Well, not if you're on the naughty list. I pensively responded. My father's drunken ire turned back to me, and I felt my heart sink, but then he laughed. Yeah, gotta be a good boy, huh? You've been a good boy this year. I shrugged and wavered on my feet. I think so. He grunted and shook his head. Yeah, we'll see about that. His vision drifted back to his TV, and I just left. I didn't ever want to interact with my father more than I had to. I went back upstairs, and Mom and I put on the Rudolph story in her room. We sat and watched for a while, and Mom seemed genuinely happy in that moment. The snow was heavy that year, and I watched it fall in droves outside my bedroom window. The wind howled and tore through the yard, and our little rundown home rattled from the onslaught of winter. The credits began playing, and I rose to turn off the TV. Mom was fast asleep by that point. I put the cassette back in its case and walked over to the window to glimpse the storm outside. It was almost hypnotizing the way it fell and blanketed everything so evenly. I stood there for a while, just watching it. The houses on the street were lit in a flamboyant display of red, green, and yellow lights, and all the occupants nestled in for the night in anticipation of the coming Christmas morning. I was about to turn away when something caught my eye further down the street. There was a man walking alone in the blizzard. The snowfall was so heavy that I could barely even see him at first. As he drew nearer, I got a better sight. He was wearing a red coat and matching pants, with fluffy white fur around his wrists, ankles, and running down the center of his chest. I recognized his attire right away. It was Santa. I didn't see a beard, though, and he looked quite a bit skinnier than I had been told. He wore a hood over his head, with no signs of his signature cap underneath. He then paused right in front of our house and looked up. Immediately, I withdrew from the window, knowing full well that glimpsing Santa was a surefire way of ending up on the naughty list. I couldn't believe it, though. He had actually come. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I heard something strange. It sounded like the front door creaking open. I rose from the ground and found that he was no longer outside the window. I thought that was weird. Santa was supposed to come down the chimney. I then, of course, realized that our chimney was much too small for a fully grown man to fit down. I heard his footsteps echo from the floor below, and despite knowing it was a bad idea, I decided I had to get a closer look. As carefully as I could, I pushed the door to my room open and tiptoed my way to the top of the stairs. That's when I saw him. He had his back turned to me, facing the tree with something in his hands. I stepped carefully onto the stairs, but they creaked as I did. Instantly, Santa whipped around and stared up to me. I felt my heart quiver in my chest as we stared at one another. His hood was still up, and I couldn't see his face beneath. My father was out cold in his armchair, with the TV still flickering in the background. Santa set down what was in his hands and turned fully to face me. He then lifted one arm, and his gloved, index finger wagged slowly back and forth. I knew what that meant, and nodded before quickly scurrying back to my room. I just hoped I hadn't ruined it for myself by seeing him. I stayed in my room for the rest of the night in eager anticipation. Down below, I heard a slight commotion emanate from the ground floor. It almost sounded like someone was fighting, but I reasoned that it must have just been Santa hoisting his bag of goodies around. Soon after, I heard the door open and shut a second later. I didn't dare venture back downstairs, and next thing I knew, I was waking up. The sun was shining bright outside, reflecting light around the street and in the windows. Mom greeted me as I awoke, and the two of us made our way downstairs. Mom seemed apprehensive, but lightened a bit from the excitement that I had. After all, Santa had actually shown up, and I couldn't wait to see what he had brought. Mom smiled as I ran ahead, and I felt as though my wish had actually come true. That changed when we got downstairs, though, and Mom's face contorted into terror before letting out a gut-wrenching scream. My father sat on his usual chair, his eyes wide and jaw slacked open. His neck had several cuts and bruises along them, and he wasn't moving. He didn't even wake up when Mom screamed. Mom panicked and dialed 911, but there was never any hope of saving him. Mom tried shooing me out of the room, but not before I saw what was by the tree. The cookies and milk were gone, and in their place was an envelope and box wrapped with red and green Christmas paper. Mom ushered me to my room as the emergency crews and police arrived. They performed their routine down below, while I inspected the gift. I opened it up and nearly fainted at the sight of a brand new Nintendo 64 console. I was overjoyed and immediately began to set it up. I paused, though, remembering the note that had been attached to it. I opened it. Dear Tyler, I am sorry that my gift took so long to arrive. You've been a very good boy, and you deserve much more than you have gotten. You are a very special young man, and I know you will grow up to be a wonderful person. I hope you enjoy your gift, and I hope that you and your mother can grow together and heal from the things you have been through. Thanks for always believing, and take care of your mom for me. Love, Santa Claus. Peter S. Thanks for the cookies. My father was declared dead soon after that, and preparations were made to lay him to rest. Mom was at first incredibly distraught by what had happened. I think it was more fear of the future than it was sorrow for my father's sudden murder. That's how I read it anyways. Mom managed to find a good job soon after that, and she and I worked to rebuild our lives together. It took her a while, but eventually my wish did come true. Mom began to smile again. My older brother Tommy never came back home, and at first I didn't understand why. He was my best friend, and I missed him dearly. I held on to that letter from Santa and still have it to this day. Many years later, I found something in an old box of my brother's belongings. It was one of his journals, and his handwriting looked remarkably similar to the note that Santa had left all those years ago. Thanks for watching, Little Nightmares. If this story gave you chills, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more spine-tingling tales. See you in the next nightmare.